we were to look at some of the superheroes of today, we'd come up with names like Superman and Batman, maybe Catwoman and Wonder Woman, Spider-Man. These are all superheroes of today that have been made popular mostly in movies nowadays. In the old days, when I was young, it was mostly cowboys for me. They were my superheroes. Some of you might remember Red Ryder, Lash LaRue maybe, Gene Autry, Roy Rogers. How about the Cisco Kid, Pancho, Wild Bill Hickok, Davy Crockett, the list goes on. Hopalong Cassidy. Anybody remember Hopalong? He was kind of like the Lone Ranger without the mask. Big white horse, 2 guns. My favorite was the Lone Ranger, of course. I just loved the music. William Tell Overture. I loved the sound of his guns. His guns sounded different than the others. And I also loved the fact that he never killed anybody. Nobody died on that show, except maybe the murder victim. He always winged them. The Lone Ranger. I lived in a fantasy world when I was young, and in my fantasy world, the Lone Ranger eventually died and left me his horse. And we lived on a ranch at that time. We called it a ranch. It was actually an 80-acre dairy farm, which I've since figured out that it's not that big. But for me, I was young, I was little, and I had a broomstick horse that I rode all over the badlands of that 80-acre California dairy farm. We had corn that was 8 feet tall, and so I could hide out and get in there, and up and down the ditch banks. There were little trails, and across the alfalfa fields, and oh man, I would take off and be gone for the day. Me and Silver, out riding around. I actually came up with, in my mind, the precursor to the taser. Because in my mind, when I shot somebody, I wanted to be like the Lone Ranger. I didn't want to kill anyone. And so I imagined a gun that would shoot an electric charge that would only zap someone for like 10 minutes. You could put a timer on it. And in my mind, as I was thinking about how I would invent this, it was especially important that when you shot someone, that they wouldn't get hurt while they were under the power of this gun. Okay? Because if you remember the cowboy shows, the coolest thing was when the guy on the top of the barn got shot, and he always fell off the barn or off the cliff, you know, and that was, to me, that was just so cool. And so I didn't want anybody to get hurt when I shot them. And then after 10 minutes, they'd get up and we could play again. And sure enough, somebody came along and a few years ago created a taser, which kind of works that way to some degree. It's a little different. But anyway, Lone Ranger, boy, he was a superhero for me. And he always got the good guy, the bad guy, and did the job. I want you to think for a minute of a Christian superhero. I mean, besides Jesus, of course. He's the superhero. But what about, do we have Christian superheroes? There are probably a few men that we would say, yeah, they might qualify. I think of a guy that has had the impact of a Billy Graham, for example. Preaching to thousands and thousands over his career. Many of them coming to Christ. What a powerful thing. I think of a man like Charles Spurgeon, who in the 1800s, before the before the invention of microphones and that sort of thing. Preached to 20,000 on a Sunday morning in his church. They built him a special church because the church was so full. He was a superhero. A guy came to visit him one time, and he took him down below. He was early, and he took him around to show him the church. And he took him down in the basement, and down in the basement, it was like 20 minutes before the service. And there were like 200 men down there praying. I think that might have had something to do with those 20,000 people showing up. It was a big deal. Superhero, Charles Spurgeon. What about Martin Luther? Started the Protestant movement. What about St. Augustine? Or John the Baptist? He preached to quite a few people and started kind of a movement as he was preparing the way for the Lord. Or the Apostle Paul, for example. Today I want to look at another superhero. I want to look at the man Peter. The man Peter. Peter sometimes gets a mixed review because you see Peter was a lot like you and me. He had his good days and his bad days. You know, we tease Peter, and someday when we get up there, I think that there's going to be some, I suspect there's going to be some crow in heaven. And some of us might, as we criticize Peter for some of the things he's done, we might have to have some crow for lunch. But Peter was actually a great man in many ways. He got out of the boat and walked on the water. Remember that? We always talk about the fact that, well, he sunk, after, a few steps. But nobody else got out of the boat. So he has that going for him. He actually raised at least a couple of people from the dead, according to the record. That's pretty exciting. He preached and converted 3,000 people in one day. Wow. Could I do that? Oh man, would that be a day? That would be the day in my life. Remember when Jesus said, "Who do men say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" Peter said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And he was highly commended for that. We identify with Peter because Peter could have those mountaintop experiences. And yet at the same time, he seemed to have that disease that some of us have, foot and mouth disease. Some of us are familiar with that. And so Peter would come from his high position, and then the next time you see Peter, he's failing terribly. Failing terribly. Well, today we're going to look at Peter at one of his highest points and then at one of his lowest points. Our passage this morning is found in Matthew 26. And so if you have that, have the Bible, you might turn there. Matthew chapter 26. Peter's just watched the Lord Jesus Christ be arrested. A troop of maybe 400, 500, 600 Roman soldiers come out to get this guy, this dangerous Jesus who's been preaching about God. And Peter, he's going to take them all on. You remember that. Lord, get my sword out. And he just tore into one servant. There's 600 soldiers here with their armor and their weapons. Peter attacks this little servant, I'm sure he's going to get me for that. But I'm sorry, and then he swung at his head to chop his head off, missed and just got his ear. You remember that? Yeah. Oh man, poor Peter. Yeah. He tries so hard. But he almost again creates a disaster. Remember, God has a plan that's working out here. And Peter, if the soldiers had reacted and killed Peter, think of where we'd be without a Peter to lead the church. And so Peter's creating a problem here. And so he's just watched Jesus be arrested. He's verse 57. We pick up the story. And those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. Verse 58. Now this is our text here. And those who had seized, but Peter also followed him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And then he entered in and sat down with the officers or servants to see the outcome, to see the end, how it would turn out. Then we jump over to verse 69, in the interest of time. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a certain servant girl came to him and said, "You too were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." And when he had gone out to the gateway, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it, only this time with an oath, "I do not know the man." Verse 73. And a little later the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for the way you talk gives you away." Verse 74. Then he began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately a cock crowed. And Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said, "Before a cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Oh boy, Peter. You know, he tries so hard. He's an impetuous man. He's a powerful man. He's a big guy. And he's used to getting things done. And he has his own perspective on things. And even when Jesus tried to teach him, very often Peter would kind of rebel against the Lord. You might remember the story of Jesus telling them, teaching them, and he did this several times, "They're going to kill me, and then I will be resurrected after 3 days. I'll come back to life." And all the disciples heard was, they're going to kill Jesus. And Peter, being Peter, he grabs Christ and takes him over to the side and says, "Lord, this will never happen to you. I will not let it happen. It cannot happen." And the Lord said, "Peter, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not listening." And so Peter, from the mountaintop, doesn't just fall. He cascades down the hill, over the cliffs. It's just like a landslide coming down. And we identify with that. We identify with Peter. We often imitate Peter. We think, "Hey, I'm getting this faith thing down pretty good. I haven't sinned in almost, maybe 2-3 days." None of us can really actually say that, by the way. At least I can't. But we get to going along and we think, "Man, God is good, and I'm He's been taking care of me. And sure enough, what happens when you get to thinking in that way? What happens? You're all smiling because you've all done it. You've all been there. You've all thought, hey, I'm doing pretty good. And what happens? Well, a temptation comes along, a frustration. Something's going to happen because that's life. And life happens. That's what it does. And life is involving good things and things that we don't like. We won't call them bad things because they're not all bad things. They may just be things we don't like. That's life. Life is not all candy. You have to take in healthy stuff too. And so, Peter is our Christian superhero for the day. And he's going to turn into a super zero. That's the sad part. And often we follow him. We follow him down that road. Look again, please, at verse 58. Peter, the superhero, never going to let Christ be taken. But Peter followed him at a distance. The King James, I think, says, followed him afar off. He hung back. You see, his boast in verse 33. Peter answered and said to him, even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Wow. That's confidence. Jesus had just quoted to them that scripture that says, I'll strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. He said, you're all going to leave me. You will all fall away because of me. Verse 31. Verse 32, they didn't hear this part. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. No, they just heard the part about them falling away. Peter says, I will never fall away. I will never run away. That was his boast. But his best shot, because of reality, his best shot was to kind of follow at a distance, to see what was going to happen. Now, lest we get too hard on Peter, the other 9 are disappeared. They're gone. Only Peter and John are even nearby. And John knows the high priest, and so he's in there kind of keeping an eye on things, seeing what's happening. And Peter, he's kind of following, and John got him in. We're told in another part there, Peter was outside, and John said, hey, let this guy in. And so he's inside, but he's a little ways off. He's kind of hanging back. He's in the corner where you can't see him very easily. Remember, this is in the middle of the night. So his best shot was to follow at a distance instead of getting up, staying close to the Lord. And there's our mistake. That was Peter's mistake. He didn't stay close to the Lord. Now again, he's not outside the will of God because God has a purpose for him. He's teaching him a lesson here. But it's not a pleasant one. It's not a pleasant one. But the error that Peter is making is he's following at a distance. He's being careful not to get too much Jesus on him. He doesn't want these people to know that he's a follower of Christ. But he wants to kind of hang close enough to see what's happening. And maybe he's thinking that, oh, there might be a way I can help. And then his biggest nightmare happens. Great big old powerful Peter sitting there, and he's fellowshipping around the wrong fire now. He's sitting beside the servants of Satan. He's sitting beside the enemies. And a little servant girl comes up, probably 14 or 15, a slave. And she says to him, "Weren't you with him too?" Hey, this guy, isn't he one of the disciples there? And so Peter has a confrontation here with a teenage girl. And he's terrified. He's afraid. And he denies knowing Jesus. You and I, of course, would never do such a thing. Actually, sometimes we do kind of hang back away sometimes. And sometimes we're kind of ashamed to stand out. And so, you know, it happens. It happens. And Peter denied knowing Jesus, and he moved away and hoped that he could kind of sneak on out, not be noticed. When he gets to the next place, verse 71, we're told that there's another servant girl comes by, and she says, "Wait a minute, this guy was with that Jesus, man." Now Peter's starting to freak out a little bit. And he denies it. Not only does he deny it, but he swears he does not know the man. Second confrontation. Another little girl. Got them all scared, running. Third confrontation, verse 73. A little later, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Surely you're one of them. The way you talk gives you away." I got to tell you, one of the things that I find gives a Christian away faster than anything is his manner of speaking. The true believer, you can almost always spot them. It's not 100%, but I remember one time when a sheriff came to our Lions Club meeting. And he spoke the whole 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it was. He was talking about it, being the sheriff and the deputies and different stuff that they were going on. And I remember thinking all that time, and there were not any swear words. He just had a different attitude. I remember thinking at the time, I wonder if that guy is a believer. And later I found out that, yes, he was. You can tell a lot by the kind of things a person says, the kind of stories they tell, the jokes they tell, for example, and so on. This is the third confrontation, and a group of people come around Peter and say, "You sound like a Galilean. I think maybe you must be one of them." And of course Peter's jumping up and down. "Now, no way." And he curses and swears. "No way. I do not know the man." And then verse 74 again says, immediately a cock crowed. Immediately a cock crowed. And then we have a fourth confrontation, which Matthew doesn't record for us. In Luke chapter 22, we read that when that cock crowed, Jesus looked around. Jesus is up there, he's being interrogated. And there's a line of sight between him and Peter at this particular moment. And maybe you've experienced this, but all of a sudden, just as the cock crows, their eyes meet. And Luke tells us that Peter saw Jesus' eyes. Imagine the sorrow and I can just see tears on the Lord's face as he looks at Peter and he said, "I tried to tell you. I tried to tell you." Peter's pride had just gotten the best of him, and he thought he could play with fire, so to speak. But he didn't get close enough to the Lord to be of a value, to really have the impact and the protection that the Lord gives. And so he was out there fellowshipping at the wrong fire, trying to stay warm. And sure enough, that little servant girl chased him right out of there. Next thing you know, Peter's eyes see Jesus. And then it just all comes down. It's interesting that Matthew and Mark Matthew and Luke and Mark all leave the story right there. And you know, John wrote his gospel possibly 20 or 30 years after these guys did. He was the only one that lived to be an old man. And we figure that he wrote the Gospel of John probably around 90 AD, somewhere in there. If you look at the Gospel of John, chapter 21, it's all about Peter. And as I was pondering this, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not chapter 21 was added later on. It seems like the end of chapter 20 in John is a good ending for the book, the gospel that he wrote. And then he kind of, it's like chapter 21 is almost like a PS, an addendum. And whether that's true or not, it sure does kind of look that way. And in chapter 21, it's all about Peter. And that's where we have the story of the Lord restoring Peter. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I do. Feed my sheep. And you remember that story after the breakfast there, the men's breakfast. It was the first men's breakfast, by the way. His blessed restoration in John chapter 21. I think John, who had read and was familiar with the Gospels that had been written, he wrote his Gospel from a different point of view to demonstrate that Jesus was God's Son. And I think when he got all through, he looked at the Gospels and he said, wait a minute, these guys have hammered Peter and kind of left him down there in the gutter, so to speak, after he ran away, weeping. And so John, who was kind of known to be a loving person, I think this is not in the Bible specifically, but I think that John might have said to himself, you know, this part of the story needs to be told. Jesus still planned to use Peter. And so we have that record. And I'm grateful for that record. Peter the superhero, a Christian superhero. Yeah, he was a zero that day when Jesus was being tried and then crucified. Peter was hiding out like the others. But God had a plan for him, and he still was going to use it. Peter's big mistake at this particular juncture of the story was verse 58. He was following at a distance. Following at a distance. Are you following Jesus closely? Or are you following afar off? That's the question each of us must ask ourselves. A few years ago, we'll close with this thought. There was a group called the Blue Man Group. They're still current, popular, by the way. And they put on a show. It's a musical show, mostly percussion. And it's loud and a lot of rock. I guess you call it rock. But it's an impressive show. They do a lot of interesting things with the percussions. One of the things they do with the drums is that while they're drumming, they pour paint on the drum. And then the paint splashes up. It's fascinating to watch. Go home and Google it. Blue Man Group. It's fascinating to watch. But one of the things that I read about as I was thinking about this when you buy tickets for this program, this show, there's an area in the first 2-3 rows that is called the splash zone. Okay? And so when you go in, you get a plastic poncho that you can wear to protect your clothes, because there is going to be in the program at different points blue and red and yellow paint splashing out over the audience as part of the show. And so I want to challenge you as a Christian to get into the splash zone around Jesus. Okay? Get some Jesus on you. And when you come out of the church, do people see Jesus splattered all over you? Maybe that's my fault if they don't. I don't know. But I'm trying to splash up here, and I want you to get some on you.
Amen.
Be close enough. Don't follow far off at a distance. But be close enough to get into the splash zone. And maybe we'll see God use some of the folks here in Whitebird in a powerful and mighty way. We're going to close with a hymn that is one of our favorites, number 410. We'll sing just the first and last verses.